All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is exactly 8 a.m. at the top of the hour for me. So that signifies the start of our webinar. As I just mentioned to everybody, welcome to you all from all around the world. It is so great to have you joining us today. My name is Jennifer, and in collaboration with my Learning A to Z colleagues, we are thrilled to have you in attendance today for our International Speaker Series event, Connecting Global Voices. Before introducing today's speaker officially, I'd like to go over a few items that will help ensure the success of our event. First, we are using Zoom, and while many of us are quite comfortable with this platform, given our experiences over the last year, there are just a few features that I want to highlight. First of all, we will remain muted during the course of this webinar. That will just ensure that we don't have any audio feedback that can disturb the flow of the presentation. So always just double check that that microphone is muted throughout our time together. You are welcome to use your webcam if you would like to do so. It is always great to see everybody's smiling faces, but it's absolutely okay if you prefer to keep that off throughout our session. What we do help everybody takes advantage of, however, is the chat box. We've already been introducing ourselves, but we hope that throughout the session today that you engage not only with our amazing speaker, but also with one another. You bring such amazing expertise to these sessions based on your own grades that you work with, the schools that you work in, and the countries that you're dialing in from. So please feel free to make comments, chat with one another, and ask questions in the chat box. We will be sure that at the end of today's session, for a few minutes, I will pull some questions that were presented in the chat box and ask them of our presenter, who will provide some responses. This meeting is being recorded, and the presentation will be made available to you after today's session in case you would like to review it or to share it with your colleagues. I also would like to draw your attention to this website that is at the top of the screen. This is the Zoom support website. If at any time throughout the session you run into any technical difficulties, my colleagues and I will be moderating the chat and doing our best to help with those. However, it is best to go to support.zoom.us in order to troubleshoot any technology issues. In addition to our Zoom platform, I'd like to remind all of us as we are dialing in and engaging in a synchronous session of our responsibilities that we have as digital learners, leaders, citizens, and collaborators. As a growing group here in our session, we again will do our best to answer our questions in the chat box. However, we also encourage professional and respectful engagement between our attendees. Now, on behalf of Learning A to Z, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Claire Henderson Venables. Claire has a wide range of experience as a teacher, teacher trainer, director of studies, and materials writer. Originally from Australia, she spent a decade teaching in Europe, where she attained her Trinity Dip TESOL before moving to Brazil in 2011. She now works exclusively as an educational consultant, writer, speaker, and is the director of Active English. Despite her wide range of experience, Claire is and always will be the most passionate about teaching children. And it has been my absolute pleasure to get to know Claire more recently. And her passion for what she does is going to be very evident from the moment she begins her presentation. I am so excited for her expertise today and what we're all going to take away from this presentation and to be able to use immediately with our own students and in our own classrooms. So, ladies and gentlemen, please help me put your hands together to welcome our speaker today, to talk about the art of storytelling, Claire Venables. Claire, over to you.
Oh, Jennifer, thank you for that absolutely lovely introduction. And hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. As Jennifer said, my name is Claire Venables, and I have been dedicated to ELT for almost 2 decades now. And you heard a lot about me, but what you probably don't know, and I think it's really important to share here, is that as well as all of the experience that I have, and if you speak to anyone, they'll tell you how much I love teaching, but they'd also probably tell you how passionate I am about connecting and learning with other educators. And that's why I am so happy to be here with the A to Z community. I'm really grateful for this invitation, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you, like Jennifer said, in the chat, and engaging with you throughout this session. Now, I've worked in a lot of different positions over the years, but my current context is in Sao Paulo, and I think the context that we're teaching in is so important. I would love to know a little bit more about you. So as I continue on to share a bit about what we're going to do today, I would love it if you wouldn't mind sharing in the chat box about who you are. I've seen that everybody shared where they're watching from today, but perhaps you'd like to let me know about your students and how old they are and what languages they speak and are learning. I'd love to find out more about that. This webinar today is the art of storytelling, and you see, storytelling is one of my favorite things to do with young learners, and I know I'm not alone. I'm here today to share my storytelling passion and experience with you in this webinar that I've called the art of storytelling. But just quick disclaimer, there are many formats for storytelling, as you know, and today I'm going to focus exclusively on the role of read-alouds in the young learner classroom. I think that reading picture books aloud to children is an art. Okay, I say art, but really it's a skill. And I think it's one that we can and we must develop. So I'd like to share a little bit about that and a bit about what I've learned in my teaching journey with you all today. I'd like you to leave here feeling confident that you know how to choose, deliver, and use picture books in a way that's going to create these really memorable and meaningful experiences in your lessons. And of course, instill in our learners from the very earliest of age that love of books and of reading and of story. Let me have a quick look at the chat box to see who we've got here today. So we've got students in Japan, 5th graders. Hello there, Marlene. Alina is teaching, bilingual students in Singapore. A very multicultural context there, very diverse group indeed. Hi, Cheryl. Cheryl's working with elementary students. We've got Noor from Kuwait, who's teaching 2nd grade English, math, science, and art. Wonderful. Kindergarten students, this is going to be a great session for you, who are Spanish speakers and learning English. Augustina, lovely to have you here. And of course, we've got Leonard, who's in Bangkok. And I've got some people, other people here from Brazil. Hello, Natalia from Brasilia, who's teaching in Bangkok. Okay, great. So we've got a lot of elementary students, a lot of students who are in bilingual contexts, some students who are also from pre-primary, so that's our kindergarten and preschool students. Wow, a big range of different people here from lots of different contexts, and I'm sure there's going to be something for everyone in this session. At least I hope so. I'm confident that there will be, but I'm looking forward to also you sharing a little bit about how what I'm talking about might potentially connect with the context that you're in. So thanks very much for everyone who's sharing in the comment box there. It is really useful for me. I'll keep that comment box up there and try and keep my eye on it as we move our way through. Now, specifically what we're going to be doing in today's session is starting off by looking at why stories matter. And I'll be showing you how we choose a read aloud. wouldn't be the art of storytelling without some storytelling techniques that I would like to share with you, and looking really at how we can insert stories into a lesson for learners whose first language is not English. So I'm going to try and give you some tips there that will apply to all of those different contexts. Before I jump in, I have an activity for you. I'd like to hear from you, and the activity is just this. How would you finish these sentences? Have a look at some of these and see if maybe one or two jump out at you and you feel like maybe sharing your ideas in the comments box here. Storytime plays an important role in what do you think? Listening to and participating in stories requires a range of what? What would you say? And of course, stories provide a natural, enjoyable context for they help stimulate a child's, and some of life's greatest lessons are. Remember, there's no right or wrong answer here. This is just a jump-off point for examining the importance of using readers with our young learners. I'm excited to hear what you have to say. And of course, as you're typing into that comments box, don't forget to check out what your colleagues are sharing as well. Stories help to stimulate a child's imagination. Sure, what a lovely, lovely sentence you've shared there. Storytime plays an important role in developing imagination and creativity. Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you, Vivienne. Marie Rose says storytime plays an important role in teaching kindergarten students. Well, that is definitely true. Alina says storytime plays an important role in a child's social, emotional, and literacy development. Fantastic. Ruby talks about how stories also help to stimulate a child's imagination. What wonderful answers. Malin says that stories provide a natural, enjoyable context for language learning. Oh, listen, I couldn't agree more with all of these wonderful answers. And in fact, I found that as more and more young learner teachers adopt classroom practices that focus on teaching the whole child, stories have become a key resource for providing this natural, engaging context for language learning. But when we read to children, we're doing so much more than just teaching them English. We are encouraging their imagination to explore other cultures. We're teaching them about the world and themselves and their place in the world. And of course, listening to and participating in storytelling moments also develops a range of very important skills: linguistic, psychological, cognitive, social, and cultural. Now, if that wasn't enough, reading aloud to children also provides them with a great model of reading fluency. So therefore, doesn't it make perfect sense to make storytelling with your English language learners a regular part of your routine? Nowadays, I almost always use authentic children's stories and less of the ones that you might find in course books for children. I wonder if anyone else here feels the same. I really believe that a library of picture books is one of the best resources that a young learner language teacher can have. And if your school doesn't provide you with books, which has been my case for the most part of my career, to be honest, I've always opted to buy secondhand storybooks wherever possible. I like to buy the large hardcover versions as they tend to last longer. And they're easier to hold, I think, when we're reading aloud. But here's another idea. You can also create a book bank with colleagues. So if you get together with some of the other young learner teachers in your network and agree to maybe buy a few books each, and then you can rotate them between you, I think this is an alternative way to get access to a big collection of wonderful stories without having to spend a lot of money. Now, in 2021, with so many classes online now, another idea which has suddenly made perfect financial sense and pedagogical sense to so many of us teachers is to subscribe to a website that offers digitalized versions of stories for you and your students to read online. I think that's been the saving grace for so many teachers who had to switch to remote teaching. However, I think, and this is really important, I think that it's not just as simple as getting your hands on some books in English. Now, I think that's a mistake that a lot of teachers have made. And when I have my trainee teachers come to me and say that they've tried storytelling without much success, I always check to see what story they've chosen. I think we need to look at some very specific characteristics that you should bear in mind when you're selecting a book to read aloud to your young learners. But first of all, before we do that, let's take a trip back along memory lane. I want you to think about the stories that you remember being read as a child. Was this part of your culture, your home culture growing up? It certainly was. In my household, my mother was and is an early years educator. So I have lots of fond memories being read to bedtime stories as a child. I wonder if you do as well. And if so, what stories were they? Let me have a look here. This is going to be very interesting because we have such an international crowd here. I'm going to read out some of these titles here. The Snow Queen from Deirdre. Elaine says Little Red Riding Hood. That's a classic. The Ant and the Pigeon. Don't know that one. Hafferty the Hamster, The Three Little Pigs, Cinderella, Bible stories, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Stories from other culture. Robin had a book of Russian fairy tales that she was read. The Papaya That Spoke. Pokey Puppy from the Golden Book series. Bible stories, The Three Bears, The Chronicles of Narnia. Wow, look at this. You know what's interesting? You know what's very interesting for me to read here is that a lot of these stories that people are mentioning, I'm familiar with. And so we just saw, we have got people from all around the world here. And yet many of us growing up have listened to the same stories. And I think that is really, I'm reading some more here that I can connect with. Go Dog Go was one of my favorites as well. And Corduroy the bear. Thanks for sharing, Bethany. So what this really shows me is story is something that can connect us. It travels beyond borders and beyond generations. Storytelling is so powerful. It's such a wonderful way to connect. And I think that's why storytelling for me is something that I feel is really important in my own classroom. Bearing in mind, this is a language classroom I'm talking about. There's something specific, I think, about creating really memorable moments when we are storytelling. And I'd like to show you some of these characteristics that we need to keep in mind when we're going to choose a suitable book for these very young language learners, especially when the level of language proficiency of your learners is not very high. You are going to have to make a very careful selection about the kind of book that you use. And I know this slide has a lot of text on it, but I feel that this information is really worth taking a screenshot of so that you can refer back to it at a later date. Now, if we think about one of those stories, such as Little Red Riding Hood was one that was mentioned there that I feel like might be something a story that we're all familiar with. Let's take a classic children's story like Little Red Riding Hood and notice how often these classic story or fairy tales or classic stories that we've all heard and know and love have a lot of these characteristics in them. So the first one I've mentioned here are illustrations which support the understanding of the text. This is really important, especially with these classic story tales, classic stories like Little Red Riding Hood that has lots of different versions on them. If you are a language teacher, what I recommend to you is first and foremost having a look at the illustrations in that book and making sure, just like a good picture book, they really serve to provide that visual support for the words that you're going to be reading aloud. Some of them do, some of them don't. Take a look and analyze that story with a critical eye. Interesting characters that the listeners can identify with. I think in Little Red Riding Hood, we can agree that there is that dichotomy between Little Red Riding Hood and that big bad wolf. Little Red Riding Hood is usually around the age of the learners that we're reading to. So I think that's easily relatable. That's something interesting as well. I think stories are often written, and illustrators and authors take lots of care to pitch a story to the age group. Well, the main character of that story will usually be around the age of the learner who the story is pitched at. So if you are reading a story to 3, 4, 5-year-olds, you'll often find that books with those main characters are perfectly pitched for the right age group. You'll also have to look for humor and lots of action, which is another popular characteristic of a great read aloud. A predictable and cumulative storyline is really important. A clear message or moral within that story. Look for repetitive words and phrases. And let's quickly jump back to that story we were talking about, Little Red Riding Hood. That is a classic example of that repetitive words and phrases that you hear when the wolf meets, when Little Red Riding Hood meets the wolf who's dressed up as grandma. And she says, "Grandma, grandma, what big eyes you have. All the better to see you with, my dear." And we hear those lines repeating over and over again. That is a fantastic characteristic for a language learner. So look for that in the stories that you choose. Rhyme and or onomatopoeia is another one to look for, and an easy to follow sequence. And as I'm reading these, so many titles of stories are coming to my mind. An appropriate length and for the age group or level. Please take care with this. Bear in mind the level of cognitive challenge involved in listening to and understanding a story in a foreign language. So make sure that if you have a very long story that you want to read to children, make sure that it's appropriate for their level of proficiency, but also their age, making sure that you're not expecting them to sit still and concentrate for longer than what would be developmentally appropriate. And of course, wherever possible, I like to look for stories which contain topics that I can connect and link into my curriculum. So I think that's a pretty big list there. Maybe some of you are wondering sort of what kind of stories you might be able to use. I do have some favorites. I do have some favorite stories that I absolutely love using with my students, and I wonder if you can guess which ones they are. Let me share them with you. I wonder how many of you are familiar with these books. The first one here, Bertie and the Bear by Pamela Allen. This book is my #1 absolute favorite, as it has all the characteristics that I look for in a story for very young English language learners. I would use this with pre-primary and lower primary, so perhaps 3, 4, and 5, all the way up to 6, 7, maybe at a stretch 8. In it, we meet a little boy named Bertie who's being chased by a bear, and a group of people chase the bear. But in the end, music and harmony prevail. This storyline is delightful, and it's so easy to follow, even for absolute beginners, right? So there are simple illustrations that provide lots of support for the text, and very easy ways to get the learners participating in the storytelling moment. There's lots of repetition, and the whole book takes under 5 minutes to read. So this makes it the perfect choice for even your youngest learners. I've read this story successfully with 2, like I said, up to 8. And there are so many wonderful, wonderful cross-curricular activities that you can do with this story following up from it. Now, another one that I love, I'm going to say this is my second favorite book, but I really think that my 2, 3, and 4-year-olds would probably argue that this is the best book on our bookshelf. They love the repetitive storyline, the flaps, which open to reveal the different animals and the different gestures and animal noises that we make as we read. I've read this one so many times that we all know it by heart. In fact, you can see one of my little students, Pedro, reading to his friends on my Instagram account. It is so amazing to watch. The third story that I'd like to talk about here is Brown Bear by Eric Carle. This is a classic picture book that's loved by children all around the world. You're probably familiar with this one. It has specific features which make it especially appropriate for the EFL classroom. It's got a very simple storyline that repeats throughout the book with that delightful rhyme. Brown bear, what do you see? I see a red bird looking at me. So it makes it very easy, even for the youngest English language learner, to follow along and pick up and participate in those repetitive lines. It's almost like a song if you find the rhythm as you're telling it. From a linguistic point of view, I think this is a great way to introduce children to the adjective, noun, word order in English, which is often different from in their first language. So red bird, rather than bird red, as it might be, for example, in Portuguese or Spanish. Children also love stories about animals, and the ones in this book are so beautifully illustrated. It's also this sort of collage technique used by Eric Carle that's so easy for young learners to replicate in an art lesson or use as an inspiration for a follow-up painting session. The next one is The Very Hungry Caterpillar by Eric Carle. If you haven't seen this book, I urge you to get it immediately. Eric Carle is a genius, and I can't thank him enough for this story. I've used this with children of all different ages as a jump-off point for learning about other topics. It introduces days of the week, life cycles, sometimes and everyday foods, colors, numbers, and so much more. Most recently, we organized a caterpillar picnic in the park and met at the weekend to eat food from the story and search for caterpillars. Now, we found 2 of those caterpillars in the park that day, and we kept them in a special box to observe them, and we watched them become cocoons and then finally emerge as butterflies. The moment we release them into the garden is a moment I'm sure those children will never, ever forget. So stories like this one can become jump-off points for a world of learning, and that is something that I absolutely love about story and about this book in particular. The next one is The Gruffalo by Julia Donaldson. This book is best for slightly older children, I feel, due to its length. Oh, sorry, I haven't mentioned The Gruffalo at all here. I've mentioned It's Okay to Be Different. The Gruffalo is another one of my favorites. You wouldn't believe the trouble I had narrowing this list down to only 6. So The Gruffalo is another one to look out for, but I have chosen to share with you a story called It's Okay to Be Different. And what I love about this story, I think, is that Todd Parr has this beautiful way of taking really big topics like difference, inclusion, and diversity, and presenting them to children in such a simple and easy to understand way. And I feel like this is a story that is so beautiful and for so many reasons, and a wonderful way of looking. There's a lot of language that we can learn from this, but really it is those values packed into this story that we can use with our students to talk about some of those bigger issues like self-esteem, like acceptance and inclusion in our classrooms. And I think this is a wonderful book to use at the start of the year to explore identity as well. And the last one here that I would like to mention is Handa's Surprise. This is such a beautifully simple and yet such a clever story that's just packed with humor. It's the story of Handa, who sets off from her home to her friend's village with a present of fruit that she's picked specially for her friend. Now, I don't want to spoil the surprise for you at the end, but I will tell you this is a story that you can easily incorporate into a typical language curriculum to provide a great context for presenting and practicing vocabulary for animals, colors, and fruit. It's a way of introducing concepts as well, such as friendship and sharing, and even talking about your favorite things. So these are 6 books that really do tie in with a lot of the characteristics that I mentioned in the previous slide, and that I have used successfully with language learners at different points in my teaching career. So I hope that gives you a few practical examples of how I look for stories and how I choose stories which would be good to watch with my learners. Now, if you've ever watched one of my classes, you probably saw me reading a story to the kids. It's one of my favorite things to do. And all modesty aside, over the years and with lots of classroom practice, I've become pretty good at it, and you can too. And that's because reading aloud to children is a skill and it's worth developing, especially when your audience doesn't speak English as their first language. The delivery is everything. So once you've fallen in love with a great book, the next step is to work on your performance. Now, there is a great book called Tell It Again by Shirley Raines and Rebecca Isbell. And in it, they say this, and I love this quote. They say that storytelling involves 3 essential elements: the story, the teller, and the listener. And a well-selected story told by an effective storyteller captivates young listeners' attention, and the 3 elements work in harmony. And that, my friends, is the moment that we are all looking for with our learners, right? That magical moment when you are reading a story and you can see in the eyes of the learners that they are inside that story with you. And this here is a picture of me reading It's Okay to Be Different. And you can perhaps see the little expressions on these faces here as they listen to that story. Well, I want to give you some tips now about how to become an expert storyteller. So here are some general guidelines for you that are going to help you prepare for that story time moment. You should always read the story to yourself. I know that sounds kind of obvious, but full disclosure here, I have been guilty of looking at a book, thinking it looks great, picking it up, and just trying to read it without having rehearsed first, and found myself halfway through going, what am I doing? So before you go public, sit in front of a mirror and practice reading that story. This is going to help you decide how you will read it. It's going to help you decide what voices and actions you're going to use and how you're going to get the students to participate in that story with you. You really do need to get a feel for the rhythm and the speed of the book, and make sure that you vary both. Now, depending on the book and the audience, you may need to adapt the language and or the length. I don't like doing this, so that's why I'm very careful about choosing the right story for the right group. But sometimes I have to, and one example is the Gruffalo. I found that I've used the Gruffalo with these younger students, and because it is in a foreign language, it was too much to expect them to listen to the story all the way through. So I've actually ended the story when the Gruffalo appears and not continued. And I've made that conscious decision. And let me tell you something else, I've stuck with it. So if you are going to adapt your story in any way, make sure that you are consistent with it. So I like to use Post-it notes. And if I'm going to, for example, simplify the language of the story, I will write that on a Post-it note. So I'm very, very consistent every time I read it. I think that's very important. Now, all of these changes need to be done before you attempt to read it with your students, okay? Another thing that we should think of is use of space. Wherever possible, designate a special area in your classroom if you're doing this in a physical classroom. Even if this means moving the furniture around, that's what I've had to do sometimes, but I've always established a routine to use during story time. For example, I like to get the children to ask questions at the end of the story to avoid constant interruptions, and it just seems to disrupt that magic that I'm trying to create if they are asking questions the very first time we read all the way through. So the students get used to this routine and they know that they're going to have time to ask questions. And I always make sure that I do allow them to ask questions at the end. Don't forget to make sure that everyone can see your book clearly. I'm going to say something very controversial here, but this is how this is the best practice I've found for my own storytelling. If you see the children in this particular picture with me, you'll see that we are not sitting in a circle. I have them sitting down in rows facing me, making sure that everyone can see me and can see the book. And the reason that I do this, the reason why I think this is so important, especially in a language classroom, is that all of their cues, all of the support that they will get for understanding the meaning of what I'm saying, because I'm not using translation. I'm using English the whole time, and it's not a graded reader. It is an authentic book. So there is a lot of language there that's going to be far above their level of proficiency. So all of the support for understanding the meaning of that text comes from the visual cues. So if they are not facing the book, often if they're facing a friend or a wall or something else and they're having to twist their body, a lot of the time their attention is going where their body is facing. And this can lead to them losing focus, losing interest, and getting distracted. And I feel this is one of the other things that I have observed in other teachers that causes them to perhaps not have as much success with reading aloud. So give sitting them in rows a go. Finally, another tip that I can give to you is to always remember that you should only begin reading when everyone is settled and focused. And make this a little fun moment, perhaps getting them using a chant or a song to signal that story time is about to start. So generating interest, easiest tip I can give you about getting children excited about story time is if you yourself are excited about it. Your students will pick up on your enthusiasm and get really enthusiastic themselves. You can present the book in different ways to engage them, of course. For example, you might slowly reveal the cover, or you might have the book hidden and you get the students to look for it, or you could even bring the book out of a special story bag or a story box. But I think those are a real couple of ways with no prep, no materials needed, you can get students excited about that story. Of course, providing language support I think is important. We're going to have a look at that and look at some ideas for providing language support in a minute. Some teachers like to use flashcards or real objects. Having them predict what the story is going to be about by using the front cover, for example. If you've read the book before, you might encourage students to recall as much as they can about the characters or the story. I don't think it is important for students to understand every word of the story for them to enjoy the storytelling moment. Do you? Would you pre-teach every word? Would you simplify the text down to a level so that they understand every word? I wonder. I certainly do not. But sometimes I feel it is important to pre-teach some of that key vocabulary that is going to help them understand what's going on. Of course, while you're reading, I think it's really important to remember the use of voice, your gestures, your body language, the rhythm, the almost, you can always find music inside some of these stories. And Brown Bear is a great example. Brown bear, what do you see? I see a red bird looking at me. And so I will find the rhythm and the melody of how I'm going to use my voice in that story, and I'll be very, very consistent with it. The same with the gestures and the body language that I use. Sometimes the gestures, the body and your voice are the language support that the children need to understand those words. So use those strategies and techniques very mindfully, and always think about how you have the students participating as well. So I'm going to keep using that Brown Bear book as an example because it's in my mind right now. This rule, I think, is valid for just about every single story that you will read. You can have children participating by copying your gestures or coming up with their own gestures, maybe making the noise, for example, like in Brown Bear. What noise does the bird make? You can use lots of different techniques like this to help students participate and become part of that storytelling moment. So if you would like to start inserting stories into your lessons, this involves even more than reading the book itself. Whether you're teaching remotely, or perhaps you're recording videos to share with your students at home, or maybe you're in the physically distanced classroom with your students now. There are lesson stages that you need to include to make story time with your learners not just fun, but also a way to instill in them this love of books, of reading, of story, and develop their proficiency with language. So I'm going to share with you now the lesson plan framework that I use so that you could try it out with your learners perhaps. But more importantly, I want you to understand my process so that you can plan your own storytelling lesson or your story-based lesson with any book of your choosing that's appropriate for the context that you're working in. Okay. So when planning a lesson around a story, I like to first start off by thinking about key concepts that are in the story. So I'm using, found a story that I love. It's a classic adaptation of a folk tale. And this one's called Little Red Hen. So let's work with this story. Let me use this story as an example because it's one that I know probably you all have access to. So in this story, Little Red Hen is making some delicious food and Cat is watching, but Cat's not helping. Neither are any of the other animals. So this results in the end of the story of Little Red Hen not sharing her food with any of the animals who refused to help her. So let's break this down. This story provides the perfect context for introducing and practicing a range of vocabulary and structures, clearly, but equally as important, I think, are the concepts and values that are presented in this story. And we can explore these in different ways with the students after reading. So in this book, let's have a look at these key concepts. In this book, what may be immediately obvious to the children is that the cat's behavior and the other animals, it wasn't really kind or helpful. I think what we would like to see in our students is when someone needs help, it's really nice to offer help when you can. However, we can also invite them to reflect on the response of the hen, and we can use key questions for the lesson to explore this and get them to reflect and perhaps think a little bit critically about the story. I think in doing so, we're enabling our learners to use their critical thinking skills and foster attitudes such as being helpful, kind, and empathetic towards others. So the key questions, just to let you know here, would be, how does helping make you feel? And what would you do differently if you were one of the animals in this story who hen asked for help? And what would you do differently if you were hen? Because I don't think that hen's attitude in the end of refusing to share her food was one that was very empathetic either. So we can really use these key or driving questions to explore with the learners these concepts. At the end of the lesson, I hope they would be able to answer or at least reflect on what their answers would be. Now, defining clear learning outcomes is what is going to help you make better choices about the planned activities that you put in this lesson around the storybook. It will avoid, I think, filling your lesson with either just the story and maybe product-driven coloring in page at the end, which I think we can and we should do better than that. We should be using these lessons, like I said, as a way of exploring or expanding their knowledge about the world, about the language, about themselves, or something more meaningful like this. But it's also going to help us when we have really clear learning outcomes. It also helps us assess how successful the lesson was. So in this lesson, I would like children to be developing important thinking and reasoning skills while learning vocabulary for food and verbs and the present continuous that appears in the book as well. This lesson, I think, also introduces genre for instructions. It could be used as a jump off point for this, for writing recipes, for example, because the hen is basically sharing a recipe within the story. And we can use this as a jump off point for exploring writing genres as well. So you can think about the key language that you might need to introduce or revise prior or post reading that's going to support their understanding of the story or support their understanding of the activity that they're going to do afterwards. like I said, I'm going to ask this question again. Do you think they need to understand every word in order to follow the story? I'm going to say again, I don't think that that's necessary or even helpful to try and pre-teach everything. Children are incredibly good at interpreting meaning when language is presented in context. Of course, you have to make sure that you've done a good job at selecting a story that has an appropriate level of challenge and concepts which are age appropriate for the group that you're working with. You have to really prepare that pre-reading stage. It's going to provide useful input. You're going to have to be mindful about how you plan, the use of images and gestures and your voice during the story to support their understanding. And if you've done all of these things, you will find that you have everything that you need to successfully deliver this story to learners, even with a very low level of proficiency. I want to share with you now the stages of a lesson, and perhaps your stages look differently, but I'd like to provide you with a framework to use so that you feel confident leaving today ready to jump in and have a go at planning a lesson around stories yourself. Now, I know that a lot of teachers love ready-made lesson plans. In fact, I'll be sharing one with you today at the end of this session that you can use. However, I don't think any lesson plan that was written by someone else will be perfect for you. I don't know what your reality is or the reality of your learners. You can and you must be able to adapt lesson plans or write your own lesson plans. And if you're new to this, I think this is a really useful structure that you can use. The first one, just as I mentioned earlier, is about introducing key language. Let me go over a few other ideas about introducing key vocabulary. Don't need to pre-teach every word, right? We've mentioned that a couple of times. However, there may be key language which is worth introducing or revising in order to prepare them for listening to a story. Here are a couple of ways you can do that. In the lesson plan that I wrote for you, for example, I've used the famous mystery box. Or in this particular story with the red hen, what I actually do is I introduce mystery supermarket bags. So I start off this story by showing everyone these shopping bags, supermarket bags that they will recognize and be able to guess or predict the types of food that might be in the bag. This works perfectly to spark their curiosity, and it will introduce them to vocabulary or a concept, the specific vocabulary that they're going to hear in the story. At the very least, it's going to activate their schemata and everything that they know, all of the vocabulary that they know about food, related to food, is going to be activated there. And then you can pull out these real items, what we call realia in English language teaching. You can pull out this realia and you can show them the objects, and you can either elicit from your students the names of them, or you can teach it if it's new. If you are teaching online, you can still do this. Is a great, in fact, I've done this online before in a webinar live with children, where I've come on with shopping bags and I've actually revealed the object from around the sides of the camera, around the edges of my screen. And that was a lot of fun to have them calling out what they thought it was. Okay, so the pre-reading activity. The pre-reading activity, let me explain to you. So you've done this activity before the story to introduce and support their language learning. What you want to do next is, when we're coming up to reading the actual book itself, there's a couple of things that I want to remind you of. First of all, again, make sure to be sitting where you can be seen and heard. Remember what I said before, make sure that they're facing the book, facing you. If you're online now, make sure that you sit close enough to the camera so that they can see the pages of the book clearly. Practice holding that book up. This is why I think online versions of stories are so great if you're in a remote teaching context, because you can have those shared on the screen. But you also want to make sure that they can see your facial expression and your gestures easily as well. Set them up for success by developing a routine that's going to indicate to them that it's story time. So I'm going to share a little song that I use. Super simple. there's probably a lot of teachers out there that have got much better songs than I do, but I just want to share mine because it's so simple and you can use it. It just goes, story time, story time, story, story, story time in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and 0. Every time my students hear that, they know exactly what is expected of them. And again, in the foreign language classroom, these kinds of techniques are everything, because students don't need to use up all of their attention and focus on working out what it is that's going on. They use that song as a little indicator that, oh, okay, it's story time. I know exactly what it is that the teacher wants me to do. We also like to agree on the kind of behavior that we expect during story time. This is a special moment. It's different to singing songs and playing games and doing book work. Listening to a book and being read aloud to, it requires a lot of attention and focus. And we can help children with this by teaching them strategies such as whole body listening. If you haven't heard of whole body listening, I recommend that you check that out after this session. Never start reading a story without exploring the peritext as well. I love the peritext is everything except the actual story itself. You can explore the cover, you can explore the byline, you can teach them that a story has an author and an illustrator. Sometimes that's the same person, sometimes it's different people. You can have a look at the pictures, get them curious, activate their prior knowledge, and this all helps prepare them for the story. Now, while reading, we've had a look at a couple of tips already. But I think that providing support during the story is just as important as before and after. Sorry, the introducing key vocabulary and the pre-reading. So encourage students to draw on their current linguistic or world knowledge. While you're reading, I think it's really important as well to read consistently, to use plenty of facial expressions, use gestures, make use of the images to support their understanding. Here's another thing that's very, very controversial, but I'm going to say it anyway, and you can make of it what you will. I personally never use the storytelling moment to test their vocabulary. I never interrupt a beautiful story like we're going on a bear hunt to point at a picture and say, what's this? What's this? What's this? There are moments when we do work with this. There are moments when I do ask them questions about the story to make sure that they're understanding, to let them answer questions. But there are moments when it is just the story. It is not time to test them on vocabulary. And I feel very strongly about this. Going to that quote that I mentioned before, I try to create this magical moment. And the magical moment, this magical storytelling moment, there is no space in that moment for me for testing. So that is a little suggestion. I wonder how other people in this group feel. You may feel differently, and that's okay too. I instead like to plan ways that I want to encourage participation using their gestures, questions that will have them reflect on or predict what's coming next rather than testing. That's how I feel. So this is actually, this particular while reading moment, this is the perfect moment that you could actually pre-record if you were so inclined. If you were doing maybe asynchronous teaching as well, you can pre-record your story and actually play the video or send the video to them to watch on their own at home or with their families, which is nice as well. So follow-up activities. Really quickly, I just want to share these 3 ideas that you can use with any story. The first one is free reading. I think free reading is a wonderful, wonderful follow-up activity. Why? I think letting children get their hands on some books to sit individually, independently, and read, even if they're not actually really reading, if they're flicking the pages, this develops a love of literature. And it's also an opportunity for you to observe and document what it is that you're seeing the students doing. I have seen students reading stories on their own, but it's amazing to see how much language has emerged naturally while I've been observing them. And this is beneficial for all ages and proficiency levels. Another one that I love is using story stones. You can see this example here. Can you guess what book that's from? Yes, you probably recognize it from the Gruffalo. These story stones were made by a teacher in the workshop that I do on the Teacher's Toolkit. And we made story stones and practice using them. Story stones are great to help scaffold stories. So if you've worked with the book many times, you can actually start using these key objects on stones to help children reconstruct the stories independently, or even create their own original stories. You can pull them out of bags and have them sort of help you put together a new story. There's something special about holding stones. This tactile element or tactile characteristic of them makes this a wonderful, wonderful material. So cheap and easy. And the last one, of course, is puppets. Puppets stimulate creativity. They engage learners in the story. They're great, especially for lower primary, and they are fantastic to put into the hands of your learners after you've been using puppets for the story. And even your shyest students may be encouraged to speak out in a way that they normally wouldn't if you weren't using puppets, if they didn't have that puppet to speak through. So I think puppets are another great resource that you can have in your classroom. And like you can see, this is my colleague Lucy Crichton, who is a wonderful storyteller. She has learned to make really simple puppets just from a square of cloth. You don't need a lot. You can also use wooden spoons if you like. You can use almost anything to create a puppet there. I hope these ideas have been useful and interesting for you. I know that teaching children can be challenging, but with support and training, it can be one of the most fulfilling jobs in the world, in my opinion. And my mission really is to transform the way English is taught to children. And to do that, I am building a community of teachers like you and offering meaningful training to them to help them find professional and financial fulfillment in their careers. Now, you might like to join me in this mission. And if you do, let's stay connected. This is where you can contact me. You can also get yourself a copy of this lesson plan that I've created around the story, The Little Red Hen. You can do that in one of two ways. You might like to sign up for my emails that I send out regularly with that QR code. Or if you're on Instagram, pop in to my Instagram account. In the bio, you're going to find a link to a direct download there that I've got the file uploaded in Google. So there's two different ways for us to connect. Feel free to do so. I'm going to hand it back over to open up for some questions.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. If everybody can join me in giving Claire a big virtual round of applause, that was absolutely fabulous. I am walking away myself with so many new ideas and thoughts, and my mind is spinning with great ideas. Specifically, Claire, I love at the beginning the checklist that you provided. I think as we're all educators, sometimes we get moving so fast and we have so many time constraints on us, but really leveraging a checklist like you shared to be purposeful so that every learning experience we offer our students is the absolute best learning experience we can offer them. So thank you so much for sharing that checklist. I know that I will definitely be using that. I also really like something that you just said, and it's really sticking with me. And it was that puppet idea that is so much fun for our students. But you made a comment about how students can speak through those puppets and use those to, if they're not reading yet, still tell stories in their own words. And what a great way for our English language learners to build confidence as they are not only acquiring the language, but acquiring those literacy skills also. So thank you so much for these great ideas. I know that
you're very, very welcome, Jennifer. And I can see that a lot of people in the comments here have picked up on some of those ideas as well. It's great to come along to these events and feel inspired, but inspiration is not action. I hope that this session doesn't just fill your head with ideas. I hope it inspires you to actually do something different in your classroom on Monday. And if you do, let me know how it goes.
Awesome. Yes. There was one question, Claire, and then everybody stay logged in because I do have an exciting announcement in just a moment. But a really great question came, I believe it was from Cher earlier in the session. She said, does it matter if the illustrations are authentic more or cartoonish more? What is your opinion about that?
I really am leaning much more towards, this is not just with storybooks as either, Jennifer. I feel this is the same with a lot of flashcards that we use in the classroom. I really love these illustrations that can reflect as much as possible images that represent something from real life. I know in stories there is a lot of fantasy going on, so a lot of the stories that I've recommended, for example, don't have real pictures in them, but we have to have that mix. I think using real images in the language classroom, especially, for way too long, we've seen lots and lots of flashcards, especially I'm thinking about, that have like sort of these cartoonish pictures of trees with eyes, and we feel like that's appropriate for little children because little children love this fantasy. But I think the opposite is actually true. We need to provide them with images that reflect real life. And really glad Sher brought this up, because it's something that was very remiss of me not to mention in the actual session: the importance of providing stories that really represent a very large range of people, large range of contexts, large range of realities, so that where the students that we're teaching can feel represented in the books that they're seeing, but also are exposed to lots of different ways of living and lots of different and diverse images of people. So that includes people of different colors and from different backgrounds and different that have got different life stories from different countries, from different cultures. I think students who have got just a really wide range of people need to be represented in the stories that we're telling. And I think that is where the realism needs to come through as well. So that was a really, really relevant question. So thank you so much, Cher, for bringing that up.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much for that response. All right, ladies and gentlemen. Well, again, thank you so much to Claire for joining us today and sharing her expertise with us. It was a wonderful and very valuable and meaningful session.
Thank you for having me, Jennifer.
Please, ladies and gentlemen, keep an eye out. Our speaker series will continue. So we will have a new speaker in the next month or so. We hope that you can join us for that. And also, after our session today, we will be entering everybody that was in attendance in a random drawing for a free 1-year subscription to RAS Plus. So if you get an email from us, that means that you were randomly selected to win a free license for RAS Plus for attending today's session. So again, everybody, thank you so much for your time, attendance. Thank you again to Claire for your expertise and your wonderful session. And on behalf of Learning A to Z, thank you all so much for everything that you're doing to support education in children around the world. We hope that you have a wonderful day. We hope you stay in contact, and we hope to see you at our next Global Speakers session. Thank you all, and have a wonderful day.